There seems to be an assumption that if China rapidly expands its military bases, that presence would mirror that of the US. But I think, as Chris's work and other work seems to be pointing out, is that maybe in some ways the US basing network is unique, to the US. That even if China does expand its footprint in that sense, it'll be in a different mode rather than the kind of like, as you were saying, like kind of 800 plus or like around 800, known bases that the US is currently maintaining at huge cost around the world.
I would view this as kind of the developments there as kind of in line with that focus on bolstering Chinese posture and presence and capabilities in the Western Pacific. But I think the general perception is China has worldwide interest, and over time we will see activity like this in other places, especially in and around the Indian Ocean and possibly in sub-Saharan Africa. But it's one of those things that's, like I quoted the official at the end of that article saying, we think it's a work in progress and we expect to see more of this elsewhere.
I always want to get kind of experts to unpack what the concern represents, kind of, or like what is kind of backed into US concerns around these issues. Exactly what the US is concerned about, especially considering the wide number of bases that it has,
So based on what I'm hearing from experts who track this stuff, it looks like that's what the Chinese international presence is shaping up to be. I don't mean to say that China isn't going to pursue more bases, but it seems like bases like what we imagine the US has are coming down the pike. There might be more military outposts, but they won't be kind of the full-fledged bases that we tend to see. There'll be small, modest military facilities. Some will be dual-use outposts, dual-use ports, commercial facilities, things like that. And some will just be mainly commercial facilities that can support military ships with lower-end needs.
You're here in Southeast Asia. You and I both read a lot of the media that's here. Do you hear the same concern from regional governments that you're hearing from the United States? Because if anybody were to be concerned about a growing Chinese military presence in Southeast Asia, it would be ASEAN governments themselves. Have you heard of the same level of concern coming from regional governments about the Ream base?
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus Van Staden, in beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, today we're going to focus on an issue that has been near and dear to our hearts, and regular listeners of the show will remember that we've talked a lot about Chinese overseas military basing in the years, focused mostly on the coast of West Africa. We actually haven't heard a lot about that rhetoric in the past year or so, even though when we were in Washington this summer, it did come up quite a bit, given the fact that it seems to be a pressing concern for a lot of people in the United States. But it's not the only place in the world that people are worried about, not just in the west coast of Africa, but also here in Southeast Asia. And in fact, here in Southeast Asia, there is probably more development going on in the Chinese basing issue than anywhere else in the world. Right close by to where I am in Cambodia, there is the Ream Naval Base. And for the past couple of years, the Chinese have been refurbishing it and upgrading the base. Satellite pictures have shown how there's now a much longer pier. Apparently, the pier is now long enough to be able to dock an aircraft carrier. At the same time, 2 Chinese frigates have been based at the Ream Naval Base in Cambodia for much of 2024, prompting suspicions that the naval facility is actually part of the PLA's plan to build its next base after the one in Djibouti. And now, all year, we've been seeing these 2 frigates based there. Then in October, those 2 frigates left for a bit, sparking a new discussion that maybe the frequent denials by the Cambodians and the Chinese that it would not be a permanent overseas base and would not be a military base for the PLA may have been actually true. Then, a couple days later, those frigates came back, and prompting new discussion that, in fact, that this is going to be a Chinese base. And the Chinese then said that they're going to donate the 2 frigates to the Cambodians. So lots of confusion over what's going on with this base. Now, the controversy over this base is largely fueled by concerns coming from Washington about China's apparent desire to expand its basing. And given the advanced stage of development of the Ream Naval Base, this is by far their number one concern. I want to give you a sense of the rhetoric that's coming out of Washington and how this discussion is being framed, because that will help guide the rest of our discussion today with our guest. Here's an exchange between State Department spokesman Matt Miller and a journalist at the department's regular press briefing in Washington. This took place 2 years ago, but it's very much consistent with the rhetoric that we're hearing today.
The PRC is secretly building a naval facility in Cambodia for the exclusive use of its military. That's supposed to be a ground station for the Beidou navigation technology. Do you have any comment?
I don't have a comment on the specific story you reference, but it is consistent with credible reporting we've seen from the PRC that the PRC is engaged in a significant ongoing construction project at Ream Naval Base. As we've said, an exclusive PRC military presence at Ream could threaten Cambodia's autonomy and undermine regional security as well. We and countries in the region have expressed concerns about the lack of transparency on the intent, the nature, the scope of this project, as well as the role of the PRC military is playing in its construction and in its post-construction use of the facility. The Cambodian people, neighboring countries, ASEAN, and the region more broadly would benefit from more transparency. We've made a very similar point in terms of the Pacific and the Pacific island nations. We have seen the PRC attempt to put forward a series of shadowy, opaque deals that they would like to see signed in the dead of night with no input or transparency and even limited visibility on the part of the governments in question. So this has been a pattern on the part of the PRC.
Now, as I mentioned, China has resolutely denied the allegation and says it has no plans to build a base in Cambodia or anywhere else for that matter. Now, just bear in mind, of course, that they also said the same thing right up until their new base in Djibouti became operational. So it's probably worth taking those denials with a little grain of salt. Nonetheless, here's Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning responding to Matt Miller's remarks at the State Department that you just heard.
China and Cambodia are comprehensive strategic cooperative partners. Our cooperation in various sectors is open, transparent, legitimate, and justified. The upgrade of the Ream Naval Base in Cambodia assisted by China is a normal activity of providing assistance to Cambodia. It is aimed at strengthening the Cambodian Navy's capability of defending its maritime territorial integrity. It comports with the domestic laws of both countries and with international law and international customary practices. It does not target any third party. We hope countries outside the region will the normal exchanges and cooperation between China and Cambodia as they are.
That reference to countries outside of the region is typical code for the United States. They say that quite a bit even to this day. Now, one of the major reasons this issue is constantly in the news is because the Pentagon continually says it's happening, even though they don't provide any real evidence to back up the claim. Now, the question in the Ream Naval Base situation is unique because the base is now built, but you're going to hear that the U.S. is concerned about bases popping up all over the world. Every year, the U.S. Defense Department is required to issue a report to Congress about military and security developments involving the People's Republic of China. And every year, they literally, and I'm not joking here, they literally copy and paste the same piece of text about Chinese basing. It was the same text from 21 to 22 to 23. Now, since it would be too boring for me to read, and I do want you to hear it, I fed the 3 paragraphs of this text that's been copied and pasted over the years into an audio generator, one of these AI audio generators, so you can get a sense of what they're saying. Again, this is not a human being. This is an AI audio generator, but it's better than me reading this.
The PRC is seeking to expand its overseas logistics and basing infrastructure to allow the PLA to project and sustain military power at greater distances. If realized, a global PLA military logistics network could disrupt U.S. military operations as the PRC's global military objectives evolve. Beyond the PLA support base in Djibouti, the PRC is very likely already considering and planning for additional military logistics facilities to support naval, air, and ground forces projection. In June 2022, a PRC official confirmed that the PLA would have access to parts of Cambodia's Ream Naval Base. The PRC probably also has considered other countries as locations for PLA military logistics facilities, including Burma, Thailand, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, United Arab Emirates, Kenya, Equatorial Guinea, Seychelles, Tanzania, Angola, Nigeria, Namibia, Mozambique, Bangladesh, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Tajikistan.
Okay, Cobus, there you have it. That's a pretty long list, but every year that list of countries generates a burst of media coverage in every one of those countries saying that China is planning to build a military base in their country. Of course, that's not true. Let's kind of get your take now on the fact that the base, or whatever this thing is in Cambodia, does appear to be materializing, yet at the same time, the concerns that the U.S. is promoting elsewhere around the world, less so. Again, also, this is an ironic accusation in part because the United States itself has between 750 and 800 known bases around the world, and the Chinese, of course, only have one. So what's your take on this whole basing situation?
It is interesting to follow it as a form of discourse because, as you say, it is very cyclical. It's like it comes up repeatedly in these discussions, and even the list of countries comes up repeatedly. So I've become kind of used to seeing it almost as like a kind of a seasonal thing. It's like the cherry blossoms, kind of like coming up in Washington. And it always kind of makes me wonder a little bit. I always want to get kind of experts to unpack what the concern represents, kind of what is kind of backed into US concerns around these issues. Exactly what the US is concerned about, especially considering the wide number of bases that it has, So it's an interesting phenomenon for me to see, but it's quite unrelated to, like, I don't read that headline and think, oh, the Chinese are building a base. I read that headline and think like, oh, the US is talking about the base again. So it kind of drifts away from the actual building of actual bases, which is why I think the Ream base in Cambodia is so interesting, because something does actually seem to be happening.
Well, we're lucky today because we have one of those experts who can actually shed some light on this. Thrilled to have on the show for the first time Chris Woody, who's a defense journalist based in Bangkok. Chris wrote an article back in July for the defense industry publication Breaking Defense. China's newest military base abroad is up and running, and there are more on the horizon. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time today to join us, and a very good afternoon to you in Bangkok.
Hello, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you, and also to talk about your reporting on this issue. You're out here in the region with us. Your headline was pretty declarative that the new base is up and running. The sourcing in the story is predominantly from the United States. Tell us a little bit about your assessment of the Ream Naval Base and whether or not you can confirm what the U.S. suspects, that it is in fact a Chinese PLA naval base, or are the denunciations and the denials coming from both the Cambodians and the Chinese? Do they have any legitimacy?
So the base, it's been coming together for a while, and these assertions by the U.S. and denials by the Cambodians and the Chinese, they've been going back and forth for some time now, really since, I guess, 2018 or so, when the U.S. started being more public with its suspicions. What we've seen over the past 2 years is a lot of these facilities coming into shape. So, notably the pier, which is about 1,000 feet long, could conceivably host a lot of warships. I don't think the port itself, the water is deep enough for a major warship like an aircraft carrier, but I think something like a frigate or a corvette could fit at that pier. It's got storage facilities. I think fuel tanks have been seen built there. I think there's been reports of dry docks under construction. So those are all facilities that could support naval ships, probably lower level repairs, replenishment, resupply. It's a place to tie up and let sailors get off the boat, which is an important thing for navies to have access to. So it's a facility for naval use. I think it's still not totally clear what the scope of activities that will be conducted there will be. Part of that is because I think they're still building. I don't think the Chinese have formally turned over what they're constructing to the Cambodians. I think there were reports that was going to happen at the end of September, but it hasn't yet, and that may just be because construction takes a while. But kind of a common theme in what the Cambodians have said is our constitution prohibits foreign basing. China is not going to have a foreign base here. But given what you described about the ships going back and forth, it seems likely, and a number of analysts have noted this, it seems likely it'll be a rotational presence. So ships pull up, they're there for a couple weeks, maybe a couple months. They're coming in and out, doing training, doing exercises, things like that. But they're not permanently stationed there, and thereby avoiding it being a permanent base for Chinese forces. It could be the case that there's a semi-permanent presence at the port, officials there handling logistics and stuff like that, but it's not clear yet whether that'll happen. And this is something new for the Chinese, obviously, but rotational forces at ports and at bases in the region are unprecedented. The U.S., I think, technically has a rotational presence in Singapore, where it has some ships that are there most of the year. The U.S. Marine Corps has rotational forces that are in the region for part of every year. So it's not totally unprecedented for what it is, but it does seem likely it'll host Chinese military presence. The scope of that is not totally clear, but we've seen warships there. I'm sure we'll see more. We'll see other personnel on the ground. There have been reports, Radio Free Asia, I think, has reported that segments of the base are being used by or are restricted to Chinese military personnel. So it's likely that there will be facilities for them there. But it's an evolving issue that's still coming together as a facility, and what it's ultimately used for and kind of what it encompasses and permits are not yet clear.
So this point that you made at the end, that there may be partial access to the base, I've seen also in your reporting that both Chinese and Cambodian officials have also said that there may be partial access occasionally for Chinese forces to the base. Do we have any idea of which parts of the base are in question and what that kind of partial access would mean? Which parts would be off limits to them, for example?
I think there's been some reporting this. I think, Radio Free Asia, the Washington Post have done some stories that have described what this might look like. I think the north part of the base, one story referenced. I'm not totally clear on where in the base they'll be allowed and what they'd be allowed to do there, but based on what we've seen being built in satellite photos, it seems likely it'll support logistical operations. So that would probably mean you'd have technicians there on the ground to oversee refueling and replenishment. If what look like dry docks are in use for Chinese ships, then you would probably see Chinese technical personnel, mechanics, engineers, things like that on hand periodically or rotationally to oversee operations at those facilities. And if the base is consistently used for kind of bilateral training, then you would probably see other personnel, instructors, officers, dignitaries, other VIPs there, on a regular basis to kind of coordinate and participate in those things. But, the base hasn't been turned over yet, so it's not totally clear, what they'll be doing there. And the Cambodians and the Chinese have both been very secretive about what's happening there, and there's a lot of opacity around what they're constructing and what they have planned. So that makes it hard to pin down exactly what we're seeing unfold, and it does leave a lot of space open for kind of speculation about what it is.
Okay, well, let's assume that they are, in fact, having some kind of joint basing relationship with the Cambodians. Why would China want to have a base in Cambodia? For people who are unfamiliar with the security dynamic in the region, why is Cambodia a logical outpost for the PLA Navy?
So that's kind of one issue that has been kind of scrutinized over the past 5 or so years as details have emerged about this. I don't think a base in Cambodia gives China a capability that they didn't already have in terms of basing or the ability to project power, but it is kind of additive. China has lots of military bases on Hainan Island, which is part of Chinese territory. It has the islands in the South China Sea that is militarized. Those are not big, robust bases, but they have airstrips. They can dock ships. I think there are reports about them having anti-aircraft and anti-ship missiles, and obviously they have supplies and they can support things like that. The base at Ream in Cambodia, I don't think it's much further south than those bases in the South China Sea, but it does give you another kind of route to approach the southern end of the South China Sea. You could coordinate activities between different forces using a different base. And then I think one suspicion is that facilities there would facilitate Chinese intelligence gathering. So I think it's conceivable that Chinese military or Chinese intelligence services based at Ream could more closely watch activity in the Eastern Indian Ocean, in and around the Straits of Malacca, as well as at the southern end of the South China Sea, and just generally improve Chinese military situational awareness of what's happening in those areas. And that's obviously a concern for the U.S. military and its allies that want to be able to move in and around those regions without a whole lot of scrutiny. And I think in the clip you played from the State Department briefing, the reporter mentioned a report about a Baidu ground station in Ream. I think there's also concerns about China setting up Baidu ground stations in various places, Ream and else, which would not only support kind of the GPS capability that service provides, but also facilitate Chinese military navigation for things like precision strike weapons or other forms of guidance. So those are things that aren't solely military, but set up at a military base. They provide benefits for Chinese forces.
In the conversations we've had over the years about particularly basing in other parts of the world around like West Africa, for example, or in the Middle East, some, defense experts have pointed out that China tends to have a kind of a concentric circle like focus on its own safety and on security, with its immediate neighborhood lying at the center of those concentric circles, with more attention being paid to the Indo-Pacific and to the Indian Ocean, to the South China Sea specifically. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether the location of the Ream base and and the activities there, whether that tends to bolster that view of Chinese engagement. So what I mean is the fact that there seems to be this kind of construction happening in the South China Sea, quite close to China. Is that taking attention away from other parts of the world? Are the conversations around, for example, West Africa or other parts of the world that's further away?
My understanding of the way this is kind of unfolded is that in Beijing and the PLA, their primary focus is the Western Pacific because China has a lot of unsettled disputes in the Western Pacific, most notably Taiwan, but there's also disputes with Japan, with the Philippines. So my understanding is that a lot of experts on this, American experts, view China as its attention and its resources being focused on security in the Western Pacific. And I think the Ream base is in line with that, given that it kind of bolsters Chinese presence and posture and capabilities around the South China Sea. I think China also has an interest in securing the sea lines of communication, which is a bit of a jargony term, but it's referring to the ocean routes over which things like oil and gas and agricultural goods flow to China. And the main ones of those flow through the Indian Ocean. I think Chinese strategists have referred to that as like the maritime lifeline. So oil and gas from the Middle East comes through the Indian Ocean, Malacca Straits up to the South China Sea, to the east coast of China. So Chinese leaders are focused on security in the Western Pacific first and foremost, and that's where a lot of their military capabilities and activities are oriented around. But they also have an interest in securing those sea lines of communication across the Indian Ocean. So that's why we see lots of interest in ports in Myanmar and Bangladesh, Ecuador and Pakistan, also Gulf ports, UAE, but also Djibouti, which is right there by kind of the confluence of sea lanes through the Red Sea. So I would view this as kind of the Ream port. The developments there is kind of in line with that focus on bolstering Chinese posture and presence and capabilities in the Western Pacific. But I think the general perception is China has worldwide interest. And over time, we will see activity like this in other places, especially in and around the Indian Ocean and possibly in sub-Saharan Africa. But it's one of those things that's, like I quoted the official at the end of that article saying, we think it's a work in progress and we expect to see more of this elsewhere.
It's not surprising, though, that the world's largest navy and the world's second largest economy would want to have military and security forces to protect its sea lines of communication and to protect its overseas investments. That's kind of the disconnect that I see in the rhetoric coming out of Washington. I mean, it feels absolutely natural that China would want to protect those interests overseas. And yet the message you get is that the Americans would prefer if China did not have any overseas military presence of any kind. But what country with the size and scale of China's interests, which are now truly global, would ever adhere to that? I mean, that's the part that I can't get my head around it a little bit in terms of what Washington actually wants.
Yeah, I think that is a factor that makes a lot of the response and a lot of the commentary seem a little discordant in a lot of the rhetoric you hear coming out of the U.S. about this activity. You would expect China with these overseas interests to want to pursue security for them. I think what kind of comes through in a lot of what you hear from U.S. officials and U.S. analysts about this activity is kind of a zero-sum mentality. Chinese advances anywhere are a setback for the U.S. I think this is kind of particularly evident, in commentary about China's pursuit of a base in West Africa. Obviously, that would be a new place for China to operate, but it's not clear to me how that would really run counter to U.S. interests, given how far that is from the U.S.
Well, I invite you to check out the China Global South Project, because I have been writing about this thing for 3 or 4 years, ever since General Townsend, who was the former head of AFRICOM, started touting this, conveniently right after Trump tried to kill AFRICOM. So we won't go into it right now, but there is a ton of stuff on our site that looks at why the U.S. and particularly the Pentagon and AFRICOM suspect there's a base, even though the research and the logic of Chinese defenses, the concentric circles as Cobus referenced, doesn't make any sense for it to have a base in West Africa. And there's another challenge that someone at the Pentagon told me this summer, was that unlike the Americans that provide force protection for their bases, the Chinese, by their own doctrine, cannot station PLA troops on overseas soil. So they need the host government to provide force protection of their bases and their people. That makes a base in West Africa extraordinarily difficult because very few, if any, of the countries have the capacity to provide the needed force protection at the levels that are required to protect a PLA base. And so there's a lot of reasons why it doesn't make sense in West Africa. Not necessarily the case here in Southeast Asia. Just picking up very quickly, just on this question of the U.S. concern, you're here in Southeast Asia. You and I both read a lot of the media that's here. Do you hear the same concern from regional governments that you're hearing from the United States? Because if anybody were to be concerned about a growing Chinese military presence in Southeast Asia, it would be ASEAN governments themselves. Have you heard of the same level of concern coming from regional governments about the Ream base?
So I do think there is concern. I haven't heard it directly from officials. I think official commentary about it is a bit more muted because of kind of the political sensitivities, given that it involves China and countries here. The issues of sovereignty are very important to them, so they don't want to be accused of contravening or running afoul of other countries' sovereignty. But, in conversations with experts based in the region and other people who work on these issues, I do think it is cause for concern. It's especially the case in Vietnam. I think from Hanoi, the view is, China has bases from Hainan Island down through the South China Sea, and now they have a base in Cambodia. So it has China's military can now kind of reach around the length of Vietnam, and that's an issue. I think in Thailand, the concern is that there's now a base basically next door. I think Thailand has some military bases in those easternmost provinces that are nearby this Chinese facility, and Thailand and Cambodia have long-standing territorial disputes in the Gulf of Thailand. So I think there's concern here in Bangkok about what Chinese presence means for kind of the balance with Cambodia when it comes to those disputes. And I think, more broadly throughout the region, Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, their officials see a Chinese base in Cambodia. They see Chinese patrols on the Mekong. They see China pursuing port projects in Myanmar and then connecting those port projects in Myanmar to China via railways. There's other forms of connectivity. I think there were reports this summer about China using railways it built to send troops to Laos. So that's a kind of a demonstration of how China could use its connectivity for security purposes. So I think officials in the region look at that and it makes them apprehensive about what China is doing. I don't think there's a fear of armed attack or an invasion or anything like that, but just kind of this growing Chinese security presence is alarming for some of them who worry about what it could mean in the future and how they could pursue their national interest if those interests run counter to what China wants to happen. But I would be interested to hear what you're hearing, because I don't see a lot of that in official commentary. I think because they want to be discreet about those criticisms.
Yeah, a lot of sensitivity about it. The Vietnamese have expressed some concern about the Techo Canal. That's a massive Chinese financed Cambodian canal development. And there were concerns coming out of a think tank in Hanoi, which was suspected to be kind of channeling the anxieties of the central government. And that kind of tied in with the Ream base, that the historical tension that exists between Cambodia and Vietnam is being exacerbated by the Chinese security presence. So again, this is a very complex geopolitical relationship, not just involving the Chinese, but also the Cambodians themselves. And so a lot gets tied into that.
We've covered reports of Vietnamese concerns around a Chinese radar base on the island of Triton in the Paracel group in the South China Sea, which is now raising concerns about possible radar surveillance and other forms of surveillance of central Vietnam. So that's just FYI, that's also jumping in. I was wondering, as you mentioned, China has one main base in East Africa that was established around 2017 and it's been operational since then. What have we learned from the Djibouti base in terms of what Chinese force projection looks like once it does have an overseas base. As far as I understand, we cover it now and then, but I haven't really picked up on particularly kind of like Chinese muscling in or like kind of like using the base in any kind of particular way, except for the evacuation of some Chinese nationals and, in cases. But yeah, I was wondering how you're seeing the Djibouti base now.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, the Djibouti base, I think they began building it in 2016 and opened it in 2017. But Chinese forces have been present in the region for anti-piracy activities since 2008. And that was lots of countries were participating in that. China, the US was there. I think France and Japan both have bases in Djibouti as well. And then other countries were sending forces to participate in those patrols. So with their presence there, they didn't just show up and plop down with the base. And I think since opening the base, the anti-piracy patrols have kind of continued as they were. They send, I think every couple months, they send a group of warships to participate, usually a couple surface combatants like destroyers or frigates with a replenishment ship to take part in those activities. And I haven't picked up on a whole lot of activity that strikes me as different from what they were doing before. In the years after they opened the base, there were lots of reports from U.S. officials about things like Chinese personnel pointing lasers at U.S. pilots as they were flying, which is a dangerous thing to do, and the U.S. are pretty bothered about that. But I don't know that there is a lot of new or unprecedented activity on the ground after that base was open. I think it's generally just supporting, evacuation operations and other kind of training stuff. I'm sure it supports the peacekeeping missions that China does in Africa. And there's lots of local activity that I'm sure Chinese forces there participate in. The Townsend, I think at the end of his tenure, did a press conference. And I think one of the examples he gave of interactions with the Chinese was U.S. firefighters and Chinese firefighters both responded to a fire at a garbage dump in the city there, and they worked together to put out a fire. And he gave that an example of how the two sides were coexisting on the ground there. So that's kind of an example.
I guess it's something.
Yeah, it's better than nothing.
Better than them shooting at each other, I guess.
That's true. So that's an example of what they're doing there. I think there's been reports of China building bunkers that could support storage of military equipment and stuff like that. I haven't seen any reports. The Pier, Townsend, and others have talked about that being big enough to support an aircraft carrier, but I don't think they've sent an aircraft carrier, an amphibious ship, or anything like that to the port yet.
No, we haven't seen that in Djibouti.
And in terms of just military activity, I think it's also notable that Chinese forces are continuing their anti-piracy patrols, but they haven't elected to participate in trying to keep the Red Sea open, which I think has caused a lot of people, not only in the United States, but also in the Middle East, to question what China wants to do there.
Yeah. I guess just to close our discussion as we talk about Djibouti and Ream as now the two physical presences of the Chinese military. Again, confirm we're not 100% sure if Ream is in fact going to be an outpost, but it's looking more and more that way. You pointed out in the article that we shouldn't expect to see a duplication of what's happening in Djibouti in Cambodia. Again, you're looking at this more as a resupply operation rather than a base that's going to have thousands of Marines based there, for example.
I think this is something I've seen a fair number of analysts say, the facilities China is pursuing, they're probably going to be modest in size. There'll be a raid around those sea lines of communication that China has an interest in keeping open and in maintaining the flow of goods to itself. They have an interest in keeping those sea lines of communication open so goods can flow to Chinese consumers. But Djibouti, it's a permanent Chinese base. It looks like Ream is shaping up to be a rotational presence. So it'll be distinct in that way. And I think, a lot of times we talk about these bases, we've talked about U.S. commentary. I think there's kind of a habit of talking about them in terms of bases like what the U.S. has around the world, in Japan or in the Middle East. But it doesn't look like they're going to be like that. I think it looks like they'll have a few outposts like in Djibouti or some other rotational presences that support kind of higher end military activity like at Ream. And then by and large, other places will be commercial ports that can support military forces with replenishment, repairs, shore leave, things like that. So based on what I'm hearing from experts who track this stuff, it looks like that's what the Chinese international presence is shaping up to be. I don't mean to say that China isn't going to pursue more bases, but it seems like bases will be bases like what we imagine the U.S. has aren't coming down the pike. There might be more military outposts, but they won't be kind of the full-fledged bases that we tend to see. There'll be small, modest military facilities. Some will be dual-use outposts, dual-use ports, commercial facilities, things like that. And some will just be mainly commercial facilities that can support military ships with lower end needs.
The article is China's newest military base abroad is up and running, and there are more on the horizon. You can see it in Breaking Defense. It's an open site, and it was written by Christopher Woody, who's a defense journalist based in Bangkok. And Chris, we're so happy that you took the time to help us put a little bit of nuance on this argument that seems, at least coming out of Washington, to lack that kind of texture. So we really appreciate it and really appreciate your time today.
It's my pleasure. Glad we could discuss it.
Chris brought, again, a level of detail to the discourse that doesn't come out of Washington. Again, henny penny the sky is falling is what you hear out of Washington anytime the issue of basing comes up. One person we want to point out in particular is General Laura Richardson, who's talking about the growing Chinese military presence in the Americas. And again, if you hear her talk, you think there's going to be just bases everywhere. General Townsend, the former general out of AFRICOM, he too was really hyping up the base threat. And then General Michael Langley, who's the current AFRICOM commander, has been very quiet on basing issues. So this seems to go depending on the attitude and mood of the generals. Keep an eye out, though, on that PLA security report that the U.S. publishes and the copy and paste. Again, I've noticed it for 2 or 3 years. Let me point everybody, though, to a much more interesting resource on this topic that came out earlier this year. It was produced by the RAND Corporation, which interestingly has a very close ties with the Pentagon. And they put out a dissenting report in many respects. I don't think they would describe it as that, but that's how I interpret it. It's called Not Ready for a Fight by Howard Wong and Nathan Beauchamp Mustafaga. And it's a report that summarizes the PLA literature and PLA researchers and their assessments of Chinese basing issues. This has been one of the key reasons why we at CGSP do not believe that there are concrete, legitimate plans that are being written up to build a base in West Africa, because the logic just doesn't make sense there. And let me just quote a few lines here from the RAND Corporation report. And it said, quote, "Without the ability to protect its bases from U.S. counteroffenses, a PLA overseas basing network would offer little utility for significant offensive operations at enormous cost during a war." One of the key things that PLA researchers brought up was that bases in places like West Africa, and to some extent even in Cambodia, need to have their own energy supplies. And so by extracting energy from very long supply chains that the U.S. could easily interrupt in the event of a conflict, these bases would be starved. And so again, we come back down to the logic, and you just have to read the literature coming out of China itself, not out of Washington, and you will see that the concern in Washington, in my view, is way overstated. Zero sum is what Chris was saying, and I think there's a lot to that. It's not constructive, I think, what the Americans are doing in this discourse.
I think from someone who comes from outside of the US, it almost seems like it's a bit of a hall of mirrors aspect there, kind of where there seems to be an assumption that if China rapidly expands its military bases, that presence would mirror that of the US. But I think, as Chris's work and other work seems to be pointing out, is that maybe in some ways the US basing network is unique, to the US. That even if China does expand its footprint in that sense, it'll be in a different mode rather than the kind of like, as you were saying, like kind of 800 plus or like around 800, known bases that the US is currently maintaining at huge cost around the world.
And you remember a couple of years ago, we interviewed some of the experts over at the Asia Society who did a report about how ports around the world as part of the BRI network are all built to PLA specifications. And I thought that was very interesting, so that in the port of Chancai, in the Lekki port in Nigeria, you could have a PLA warship docked there. It seems to me that is more of the direction that they're going in than physical big basing networks like the United States has built. Let me just bring one more quote from the RAND report. And I think this is, again, it just speaks to how off I think the U.S. narrative is. And again, this is coming from RAND. So this is not coming from some liberal lefty organization that's anti-war, anti-military. They say, quote, "While the PLA's interest in developing overseas bases remains an issue to monitor, at least in the near term, it is unlikely to manifest into a significant wartime threat to U.S. operations through at least 2030. Now, 2030 isn't that far away, but again, I think the RAND report and the tone from Chris is a much more sober analysis of this than what we see coming out of the think tanks in D.C. and certainly coming out of the Pentagon and State Department.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, obviously, the reason why there is sometimes the discourse reaches such a high level, I think, within Washington is that there is this much wider discourse about a possible war with China, or from some quarters, the inevitability of a possible war with China. And of course, the high level of energy that comes around the basing discussion fits into the high level of energy around that issue, which is its own kind of wider issue, and something that I find quite worrying because it does tend to take on a momentum of its own. Many commentators or many people who are in that conversation immediately flip from the possibility or the chances or the need, quote unquote, for that conflict, flip from that into the sports team logic of who has which ships where, and how do we, our team, compare to their team. I find that kind of tendency in DC conversations quite worrying, because it then tends to kind of pile on top of each other, and it tends to snowball kind of in this kind of rhetorical way. And it has a kind of a China-specific danger, because China can be sometimes appear so monolithic, and Chinese state organs are like the things they say is so, the language is so controlled and so coded, and there's so little kind of free discussion coming out of China to counter this conversation, that China becomes a kind of a blank screen to project anything on. That's a tendency in DC that I find quite worrying.
But we should not kind of put a blanket over all of DC, because part of the Pentagon and the State Department press corps has the same level of skepticism that you and I have towards this issue. And every time that both Matt Miller and then John Kirby's the spokesperson for the National Security Council, bring up the question of Chinese bases, parts of the press corps come back up and say, prove it to us. Where's the evidence to support this assertion? And there is a message that comes from both Miller and Kirby that says, we can't tell you because it's classified. So you just have to trust us. And what I don't think that either the Pentagon, the National Security Council, and the State Department truly understand is that the United States does not have any more credits on the trust us account. After what happened in Iraq, where everybody said, trust us. There are weapons of mass destruction there. And we went, okay, it doesn't seem like it, but okay. They have not lived that down, particularly in the global south. And this comes up over and over again in the press briefings on these issues. So not everybody in Washington is buying it. However, I do want to call your attention to some of the reporting that's been done by the Wall Street Journal, which has been nothing short of just shockingly bad. Be careful of some of the reporting come out of the Wall Street Journal in Africa that basically takes unnamed U.S. sources and basically says, this is going to happen. It's not actual journalism. It's just sonography from, the Pentagon. And there's quite a bit of that. And what ends up happening is when a publication like the Journal, and I think the Washington Post has done a little bit of this, when they run something, it just takes off in the African press as legitimizing it. So be very careful when you see these reports about who the sourcing is. What they're not doing is they're not reaching out to Chinese military scholars, not even scholars who are based in China, but there are Chinese military scholars in the US, in Europe, in many parts of the world that can tell you very quickly that this story doesn't line up the way that it's often framed to be. So the press reporting on this is very, very mixed, which makes it very difficult. Also, be careful of that language coming out of that annual report to Congress that oftentimes just feeds this excitement in many of the global south countries that are named in that report as potentially having bases. I heard Namibia, in Namibian media, they were like, China is going to build a base here. Why? Because the U.S. Congress said it was going to be. And you're like, oh, man, no. So it's a tough story to follow.
Yeah, it's one of those news stories that live almost in the field of myth more than actual reporting and actual hard information, because everything is unknown sources and everything is classified. And one very seriously gets that problem with Wall Street Journal reporting on it.
I sympathize a little bit with the Chinese on this one because, the U.S. says, well, we don't want to contain China. We don't want to block China's rise. We want China to be a responsible stakeholder in the international community. But as well as I know, that if the PLA Navy started escorting ships in the Red Sea, they would freak out in Washington about that, right? And what they want is to put PLA ships under U.S. command in these multinational operations. There's no way that would happen, the same way that the United States would never go under PLA command for any operation, right? So it just feels like, again, I don't want to sound like a panda hugger here, but I just feel like in one sense, it's a little bit frustrating that the rhetoric is we don't want to contain, and yet when a country as large and with such a big footprint as China has, which has a legitimate right to protect its interests around the world and its sea lanes around the world, and when they move to do that, then hysteria breaks out. That feels incongruous to me. And it's just, I don't know. It's just not very coherent.
Well, I guess it makes sense in all the contradictions starts making sense in the larger issue, which I think is the bigger kind of thing that like conflict that underlies all of this discussion is how is the US going to make space for another superpower-sized power in the world? And how is that going to work? Considering that all of the knowledge systems in the US around how to run these global systems are based around the concept of being a single superpower. So that's the bigger question, I think, that no one really has an answer to.
Well, they're not going to make space, at least for China, right? I mean, that much we know.
I mean, I guess.
Well, they don't want to make space.
They don't want to make space. But at the same time, the implication of China being a responsible, quote unquote, kind of like international power does imply something, right? Kind of like it does imply, for example, peacekeeping missions. So space will have to be made in some way, I guess, because otherwise it's, kind of like the other logic again is conflict, And of course, those two logics are running parallel in Washington conversations all the time. And I think people kind of jump between them, so there isn't coherence in that conversation. The conversation is kind of all over the place. And in that way avoids a kind of a real reckoning of what the US actually wants from China in this particular field.
And of course, you're seeing that battle over space being waged right now in the South China Sea, where China has literally changed the equation, has created the space for itself. The U.S. and its partners are trying to hold on to the space that they have through freedom of navigation operations. But that is the front line, is right here in the South China Sea area and to some extent off of the eastern coast of China and the East China Sea. So keep an eye on that. Well, very exciting for us to be able to talk about the basing issue, not in an African context, but here in Southeast Asia. We're going to keep an eye on this topic going forward. As I said, we've got a lot of great analysis on these basing issues on our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If this is a topic that you're interested in, definitely check it out. We know that a lot of folks at the Pentagon, at the State Department, and even in the Chinese Ministry of Defense and Foreign Affairs have been following our analysis on this. And in fact, just because there isn't really a lot out there. So if you want to see what they're reading, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com. You'll need a subscription, but it's super affordable. We give you 30 days for free to try it out. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. That's what supports us and the work that we're doing by providing fact-based, independent journalism on what the Chinese are doing all over the world, and especially here in places like Southeast Asia and in Africa, where COBIS is. And don't forget, if you are a student or a teacher, just send me an email with your academic account, and I will send you half-off discount links to the China Global South project starting at just $10 a month. So that'll do it for this edition of the China Global South podcast. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode. So for Cobus van Staden in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. We'll be back again next week. Talk to you then.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.